Today's shiur is going to deal with three essential, crucial themes in Parshat Vayeishev, with Mechiras Yosef. And particularly, we're going to take the approach of the Seporno and that school of thought. That'll be theme number one. Theme number two is going to be dealing with how Joseph was able to analyze the dreams of the butler, the Sar HaMashkim, and the Yofa, the baker, the chief baker of the Pharaoh. And our third theme is going to deal with the Rav's understanding, Rabbi Soloveitchik's understanding of the link between the Parsha and the Haftarah. Let's start with the first theme, the sale of Joseph. What bothers all of us? I mean, this is the Shiftei Ka. These brothers are the brothers that we call our role models. They're the ones who shaped and defined the nation as a function of their unique, distinct talents, etc. And you read this, and if you read it on a superficial level, Parshas Vayeishev, I'm not talking about Miketz where they do tshuva and Vayigash, but in Parshas Vayeishev, you would think this is the Sicilian mafia. What is this? Michael and Fredo of The Godfather? Chas v'shalom, God forbid, 1,000 times over. But that brother would kill brother? That brother doesn't kill brother, but abducts, kidnaps, and sells brother? What's happening there? What is the rationale and the logic behind the brothers in terms of their, whether you want to call it tension, animosity towards Joseph? That's the issue. Well, let's start with the beginning of the Parsha. We understand that there's a certain tension and animosity they have towards Joseph. After all, he's called the Ben Zekunim. So if you look, Rashi quotes the Targum Onkelos. Ben Zekunim, according to the Targum, is not referring to the son of his latter years, because after all, Yaakov Avinu, Jacob had 11 sons in the period, 11 sons and one daughter that we know explicitly. The Medrash says that there were twin sisters that were married, that were born in these unions. But he had, that we know of, 11 sons and one daughter within what? Within a 7-year period. Meaning, the whole gap between Ruvain and Yosef is all of about 6.5 years. Not to mention what? That the gap between Yosef and some of his other brothers is maybe a year, maybe a half a year, maybe 2 years. So Ben Zekunim, in the modern sense that we use the term, as well as the historical sense, is somebody who was born later in life, that there was a gap of 8, 10, 15 years between children. That's not the case with Yosef. That's why the Onkelos, which Rashi quotes, calls him Bar Hakim. What does Bar Hakim mean? It means this is the son that Yaakov transmitted the Masorah. That Masorah, that tradition, that understanding, in-depth understanding of all the philosophical and theological principles that Yaakov learned in the yeshiva, the great institute of Shem Va'ever, that he internalized from his mother and father, from Yitzchak and Rivka, that he internalized from his grandfather, that whole monotheistic, ethical monotheistic tradition, what we call the Masorah. Who would be the master? Who would be the one responsible for transmitting that to the next generation? It would be Yosef. Doesn't mean the other brothers didn't learn. It doesn't mean that the other brothers and sisters weren't knowledgeable and had a good understanding. But who would be the master, the Baal HaMasorah? The Ben Zekunim, again, Bar Hakim, the Ben Zekunim, that was Yosef. So right away we have, and the Medrash develops this whole idea of the uniqueness and the similarities between Yaakov and Yosef. Even in Midrashic tradition, you see he's like a fourth Av, as if there were, we consider we have 3 Avos. The fourth Av almost is Yosef. So right away he was unique and distinct. The Ketones Pasim is what? Is representative of that unique, distinct role that he played and that he had. Now Yosef, and we'll talk about this when we speak about the Haftarah, has a nevuah. 2 nevuos. One is the whole notion of the sheaves. The sheaves of the brothers bowing down, deferring to who? To his sheaf. What is that representative of? Economic, financial dominance. Economic, financial leadership. And he has a need to tell his brothers. Then there's a second nevuah of the stars and the moon prostrating to the Joseph. The stars, the moon, and the sun, I apologize, prostrating to Joseph. What is that? What is the notion of the stars, the moon, and the sun? It's the cosmos. It's spiritual. It's eternal. It's, so to speak, a cosmic leadership role. That Joseph would be what? Would be a role model and a leader. He would lead the family economically, financially, politically. That's the first of the nevuos. And then he would play a role leading them spiritually, intellectually, in terms of the destiny of the Jewish people, the eternal cosmic destiny of the role that that the Bnei Avraham, the Bnei Yitzchak, the Bnei Yaakov would play. Well, the brothers did not see that as a nevuah. What did they see? They saw in Joseph an extremely charismatic, an extremely dynamic, engaging individual. He had father in their mind wrapped around his finger. He had father in their mind in his back pocket. And you know what they saw? They saw him looking to dominate. Imashol timshol, maloch timloch. Looking to what? To dominate, to almost, so to speak, create two strata, where there would be the leadership or the control strata, and then there would be the peasants or the serfs. In other words, they were coming from a world where Yishmael, no matter how good he was rejected. He was not someone who could continue the Masorah. And there was one Masorah community to the rejection and to the exclusion of another. Yitzchak to the rejection and exclusion of Yishmael. In the previous generation, it's Yaakov to the exclusion and rejection of Esav. They saw Yosef trying to create the same phenomena. Instead of the development of the nation coming through the 12 strands, instead of the development of the nation coming through the different contributions together of the Bnei Yaakov, of the Bnei Yisrael, they saw what? They saw him trying to destroy that notion of a nation and create two strata in its place. The dominant versus the peasant. The dominant versus the second tier. That's what they were concerned about. And what happens? And I'm using a terminology that you see in this school of Meforshim. Again, the Seporno, amongst others, articulates this idea. They saw him as a rodef. We know what a rodef is. A rodef is someone, right, who comes and pursues, comes with a gun and knife, tries to kill someone. So there's two types of rodef. There's the physical rodef, who literally is a threat to one's physical existence. And then there's the, so to speak, there's something much greater. We'll call it the spiritual rodef, someone who's going to destroy the nation otherwise. So they perceived him as a rodef, destroying the whole viability of the nation, destroying the whole future and potential of the Jewish people, of what would emerge into a multi-tiered Jewish nation. Now, how do you deal with a rodef? So we know from Masechta Sanhedrin, I'm borrowing the halachic concept because that applies very much here. If you could stop the rodef, to quote the Gemara, Yachol lahatzilo be'echad me'evarav, if you, for instance, were a sharpshooter, and you could shoot the rodef in the shoulder so that the rodef couldn't shoot, let's say he was right-handed, you shoot him in his right shoulder, he can't shoot his gun. You've saved the nirdaf, you've saved the victim, without having to kill the rodef. However, if you can't save the nirdaf by being a sharpshooter and shooting him in the shoulder, then you have to kill the rodef in order to save the nirdaf. You have to kill the pursuer. You have to kill the threat in order to save the victim. So there were three schools of thought when it came to Joseph. Three schools of thought amongst the brothers. School of thought number one was Shimon and Levi, and that is he's a rodef. You have to kill him. You have to stop him. He's going to destroy what will be the Jewish people. He'll destroy the nation. He's a megalomaniac. He's sick. He's got these needs to dominate. He's got the talents, the ability to do it. He has to be killed. He's a threat. He will undermine the whole viability of what will emerge into Am Yisrael, the whole viability of the Masorah community. Reuven disagreed. And God testifies in the Torah. Reuven did not perceive him in that light. And then there was a third opinion, that was Yehuda. And by the way, here's the beginning of where we see Yehuda emerge as the leader of the brothers. Yehuda said, no, you can break him psychologically. If we take him away from father, if we sell him as a slave, why do we have to kill him? Why do we have to slaughter innocent blood? Again, Yachol lahatzilo be'echad me'evarav. If you can save him by shooting one of his limbs, then what? Then you can save the threat. You can stop the threat and save the victim, meaning the future of the Jewish people. By breaking him and detaching him from father will destroy him psychologically. He won't have the ability to what? He won't have his whole leadership, his whole notion of being father's continuity is always in the context of father. It's with, so to speak, the gushpanka, the imprimatur, and the support to father. But if we detach him from father and we remove him, what will happen? That ego that they perceived as being unhealthy, as being sick, as being a megalomaniac, it'll be broken, it'll be destroyed. And that's why, by the way, years later, when they went to Mitzrayim, when they went to Egypt to look for him, The Medrash says, what does it mean that they didn't go as one community? They went through different neighborhoods. They went into the brothels. They went into the seedy sections of town because that's where they assumed they would find him. Because they assumed that once he was detached and separated and broken from that attachment to father, he'd become a decrepit, an immoral, not the finest. They misread Joseph. Their mistake, what was their mistake? A judge can determine who is a rodef, meaning an objective third-party observer. When you perceive yourself as a nirdaf, when you perceive yourself is being threatened by Joseph, how can you be objective? Adam karov eitz latzmo. A person is subjective when it comes to themselves. I can be objective about you. I can't be objective about myself. That's the famous phrase that the Kohanim can say. Roa kol negoim chutz minigei atzmo. A Kohen can see all kinds of deformities, of all kinds of problems, of blemishes, but you can't see your own blemishes. So how in the world could they be objective and determine him as a rodef? And that was the mistake that the two schools of thought, Shimon and Levi, who wanted to execute him, and Yehuda, ultimately, who won out, who said that we can break him psychologically, which is the equivalent of what? Of shooting him in the arm, of preventing the threat from taking place. Yehuda, who won out, who became the leader, who they followed, they misread Joseph. They sold him short. They did not understand him. They didn't appreciate who and what he was and what his potential was. So what happened? In the end, they come to realize, they come to acknowledge who and what he is, and that father was wise, and that father really did understand. After all, when it says Vayigar bo aviv, when father chastised him publicly, that was strictly a public chastisement to try to what? To try to ease the situation, to try to allay their fears and their concerns and their animosity. But it says Vaviv shamar es hadavar at the end of the first aliyah. But father waited. Look at Rashi, he was yearning and waiting and anticipating for the day when these nevuot would be fulfilled. As opposed to what? As opposed to the brothers who thought this to be the ravings of a madman, of a megalomaniac, father saw it as a nevuah, and he was waiting for it to be fulfilled. Father knew better. Father understood better who and what Joseph was than the brothers. That's our first theme. What we've tried to do is to explain and understand exactly what was the rationale, what was the motivation of the brothers. God forbid, this is not the Sicilian Mafia. This is not Michael versus Fredo in The Godfather. That's not what we're dealing with here. That was the rationale. The threat to the very existence, survival, and future of what would be the ethical monotheistic community, of what would become Am Yisrael. Number two, the second theme is Joseph vis-a-vis the dreams. Now, what's fascinating here, and the Talmud in the 9th parak of Masechta Brachos is articulating a vision that gets articulated in different terminology, in different formulation in Sprach, but gets articulated again in the 19th and early 20th century by Dr. Sigmund Freud. And what is that? That how do dreams work? Essentially, what is a dream? A dream is, during the day, your conscious suppresses and it controls the subconscious. It controls, suppresses to a certain degree the unconscious. What happens? At night when you're asleep, when the conscious is not controlling and suppressing the subconscious. What happens? So your fears and your anxieties, your greatest fears and your greatest anxieties, they come out at night. That's why people have horrific dreams about the death of loved ones, about terrible things taking place to people they care about loss of financial loss. And not only is your fears and anxieties allowed to run wild and come out, but what? Your desires, your aspirations, your wishes, your hopes, your yearnings, right? People have dreams about fantasies that they become very embarrassed of. They have dreams about attaining certain wealth, sexual fantasies, other components of things that they don't realize. It gives them, when they look at their dreams, they understand what makes them tick, what they're yearning for, what they want, what they desire. Sometimes dreams are very beautiful dreams because we have noble, we have glorious, we have elevated, transcendent dreams that talk about our wishes for our children, our wishes for our people, our wishes for ourselves, our close ones, our wishes for world peace. But again, what is a dream? It's a subconscious. It's your desires, your aspirations. It's your fears, your anxieties coming out. And that is exactly what Joseph saw in the butler and the baker's dreams. With one little prelude from the Medrash, we'll get into that in a minute. Fascinating Medrash, it says that there were four essential fathers of different types of knowledge. Adam Harishon, was the father of scientific knowledge. He was the first zoologist. What was he given? He was given the job of giving names to the species. What does that mean? He was a scientist who observed the species, their nature, their character, and the name reflected the essence of each and every species, a fowl, a reptile, amphibians, mammals, etc., in terms of what makes them, how they work, what is their essence. So he was the father of scientific knowledge. The Medrash says Avram Avinu was the father of philosophical knowledge. He was the first person in the history of humanity that came to the rational, logical conviction that God exists and that God runs the universe. And he did that through philosophical inquiry. Way before any nevuah, way before Alech Lecha nevuah. What? Through rational investigation. And the Rambam says it two midrashim. One that says he started to be makir es boro, to acknowledge God at 3. The other says he started to acknowledge God. One Gersa says 40, the other says 48 years old. What does it mean? The Rambam says it's not contradictory. It was a process. He started as every young child who's inquisitive and asks questions, and he explored philosophically. He took different approaches. He saw they didn't work out logically, they didn't work out rationally. He tried other approaches until he came ultimately to a system of life where he acknowledged that there's one creator that created the universe, sustains the universe, that providentially controls the universe through hashgacha klalis, through the laws of science, and hashgacha pratis, through the specific providence. He came to this body of knowledge through rational, logical investigation. So the Medrash says that Avram's the father of philosophical knowledge. The third individual in this Medrash is Joseph. Joseph is the father of psychological knowledge. Through this Parsha, the analysis of the butler and baker's dreams, and we'll see in next week's Parsha in Miketz, his analysis and his great understanding and insight into the mind of the Pharaoh, he's defined as the father of psychological knowledge. So let's see, what did Joseph see? Well, the first clue and the first key issue here is the following: that in 3 days will be Yom Huledet Paro, Pharaoh's birthday. Now that's an important fact to understand. After all, the butler and the baker have been months in prison. They've been months in prison. Why now are they starting to have these dreams? Because you know why? The pharaohs projected themselves as a god, and the people believed that the pharaohs were a god bestowed to mere mortals. The birth of Pharaoh was when a god came to earth, when a god came to control this earth. After all, Mitzrayim is the great empire, one of the great empires of its time. Eventually, as a function of this famine, it became the dominant empire on the face of the earth. So who is the pharaoh? The pharaoh is someone to be worshipped. And we know late from the pharaoh in the time of Moshe that the pharaoh, for instance, couldn't allow people to see him urinating or defecating, because after all, how could a god do things like that? A god is greater than mortals. So what happens? What happens is the following: that the pharaoh, on his birthday, on that religious holiday, that pagan holiday where they worship the fact that a god was bestowed to mortals, men are made and men are broken. That's when people receive, what's it called when you get, not demoted, promoted. Promotions take place on the birthday of the pharaoh. Demotions. Executions take place on the birthday of the pharaoh. And that's when pardons are given. Why? Because the birthday of the pharaoh is when the god bestows either grace or justice to his servants, to his subjects. And they were scared. And they were really, really scared what would become, because they knew, so to speak, that there's a very good chance that their fate is going to be made or broken on Yom Huledet Paro, on the pharaoh's birthday, on that religious holiday. So you dream about your fears. You dream about your anxieties as well. You dream about your aspirations. Now, the Medrash, and you'll see why the rabbis said what they said, based upon the dreams of the butler and the baker, they give us an insight. They say the following: you know what the, so to speak, the sirchon, the violation of the butler was? A fly got in the pharaoh's wine. That's why he was sent to prison. You know what the sirchon, the violation of the baker was? The Pharaoh bit into his muffin or his bread, his croissant, and there was a stone, there was a pebble in the dough. Now, those are very different violations. Why? Remember, this is pre-air conditioning. We're talking about Egypt. It's extremely hot. It's very possible, and especially think about those of you in your sukkah, when the wine comes, all the bees, they like that. There's a sweetness, there's a richness to the wine. You can imagine that it's possible that a fly somehow could get into that wine. And it's not a function of the fact that the butler wasn't doing his job. He could have gone to pour this or to get that or to do the other, and somehow a fly could get in there. Not so when it comes to a stone. A stone in the dough? This is a process called sifting. You sift the flour, and then you knead the flour. A stone in the dough should have been detected. Not only forgetting the process of the sifting and the lisha, the kneading of the dough, before that, during the techina, during the grinding of the flour into dough, that should have been taken care of. For a stone to get into the dough shows a real sense of callous, a real sense of insensitivity, like you're not caring about your job. And that's why we're going to take a step back. Why the rabbi said what they said? For the same reason Joseph interpreted these dreams. The dreamers, the butler and baker who dreamed the dreams, they actually tell us what's going on in their world. It's very clear that the butler loved the Pharaoh, and he considered it an honor to work for him. Because listen to how the dream goes. There's such detail. It's one of the places that I'd say it's, in terms of nauseous detail, it's probably got more detail than any other place in the whole Tanakh. And he talks about what? There was a vine, and Shlosha Sarigim, and 3 vines stem out from it. And it starts to flower and blossom. And then the blossoms fall off. And then comes what? The basic bud of a grape. And then the grape starts to ripen and nurture and develop into bundles and clusters of grapes. And what? Then he says, and I take the grapes and I squeeze them, v'eschatosam, into the cup of the Pharaoh. Do you see the tremendous detail that he gives the butler? He cares, he loves, he's proud to be the Pharaoh's butler. And you know what? That comes across in his dream. And he's scared. And he's hoping. He wants nothing more than to go back, to be the right-hand man, to be there serving the leader of this earth, the God on earth, the Pharaoh himself. And he cares and he loves his job. And you see that from the detail, and you see that from the development, and from the care and concern to every particular component of producing of the wine. Well, you know what? Pharaoh, and we know the Pharaoh from next week's Parshat, from Miketz, has a good read on people. He knows that about his butler. He knows who his friends are, who his loyalists are, who cares about him, who's there for him. Butler has to be punished. You have to make a statement. Can't have a fly going into the Pharaoh's cup of wine. It's embarrassing. It doesn't look good. And a statement has to be made. But he will restore the butler to his position. None of that detail, none of the specifics about planting the wheat and about harvesting the wheat and about grinding the wheat and about sifting the wheat and about adding water and kneading the wheat and about giving it a special type of fire that will produce the proper bread and the proper maturation of the bread. None of that detail is there in the baker's dream. Look at the baker's dream. It says the following. There were 3 baskets on his head. Now, what do you mean you're putting a basket of bread on your head? You know what happens when a basket of the bread on the head? The birds can get to it. You're not protecting it. You're not looking after it. You're not taking care of it. You know, there's bread in the baskets. That's about all you have, other than the fact that the birds are going to be eating from it. What's the point? The baker doesn't care. This is, by the way, Shvi'i, the last aliyah of Parshat Vayeishev. The baker doesn't have care and concern. This is not America, you know. I'm the chief baker at the Ritz-Carlton, and I'm a member of a union, and I can quit whenever I want to quit, and I can get a job working at the Waldorf or at the Four Seasons. You know, you have to work for the Pharaoh. You don't have a union, you don't have options. And he resented it. He resented and despised the fact that he has to be the Pharaoh's baker, and he's at the beck and whims of the Pharaoh and the queen and the administration. And he resented his job, and he didn't put a whole lot of love and care and concern into his job. And that's reflective of the dream. And the Pharaoh knew that. The Pharaoh knew that, because how in the world do you allow a stone into the bread? How does that happen? From a lack of care and concern, from a focus, instead of a focus, a negligence. And that's why it says, in 3 days, and he also had fear and anxiety about what would be in 3 days, and he was afraid what would happen to him. The whole notion of the birds eating away, well, so to speak, the baker, his identity as a baker, he would be eaten away. Not his bread, but his flesh would be chirped on, would be eaten by the ravens and the birds of prey as he was swinging Nebuch from a tree after being executed by the Pharaoh's executioner. Just like the care and concern and the yearning and desire of the butler came out, so too the lack of care and concern, the animosity, came out of the baker. And the Pharaoh, as we said, was a wise man. And he knew who his friend was and who his loyalist was on one hand, and who was not on the other. Joseph, when the Medrash says was the father of psychological knowledge, that's just the point. He had the ability to understand, to read people. And we'll see that next week's Parsha. We can develop this in terms of his understanding and analysis of the Pharaoh's dreams, in terms of his reading and understanding of the brothers. It comes across very well. The third theme we're going to talk about is the link of the Haftarah. Now, Rabbi Soloveitchik said, and by the way, this was just published in an OU Sefer that we came out, Rabbi Avishai David, Darosh Darash Yosef, a Sefer that he has of the Rabbi Soloveitchik's talks in Boston to the Boston community at the Maimonides School on Motzei Shabbos. And he writes up, these were talks that were given for many years, but the years that he attended, Rabbi Avishai David, were 77 to 82. And in one of the talks, the Rav linked the Haftarah to the Parsha. And he said, the Rav said, many people think that the link is what? In the beginning of Amos' Nevuah, he says what? And I'm going to quote from the beginning of the Haftarah. The first verse. Al michram ba'kesef tzadik ve'evyon ba'avur na'alayim. That they sold the righteous one, Yosef HaTzadik, the one who was needy at that point because they'd stripped him of all wealth and of all ability to take care of himself. Ba'avur na'alayim. What do they do with the funds? They bought shoes. And what's the idea of the Medrash? The insensitivity. The insensitivity to father, to what this would do to father, the insensitivity to Joseph, the insensitivity to maybe there was another position. Maybe they shouldn't be so confident. Maybe they aren't so right. Maybe they should listen to Ruvain. Maybe father does know better, knows a little more than they do. Nalayim, when you have shoes, right, you don't feel the terrain. The bottom of your feet, especially what we call the kaf, that part of the indenture in the foot. It's sensitive to stones, to pebbles, to prickers, and by having shoes on, you don't feel a thing. In the mikdash, we don't wear shoes. In the mikdash, it's a place of sensitivity. So by buying shoes, it's a reflection of their insensitivity to father and to their brother. That's how some learn the link. The Rav felt it was from the bottom of the Haftarah, from the end of the Haftarah, not the beginning of the Haftarah. Because it says the following. They despised Joseph for what he shared with them about his dreams, his nevuot, that he communicated this to them. And they tried to squelch it. But the end of the Haftarah says the following. I gave you Nazirim, and what did you do? You forced them to partake of wine. I gave you prophets, and what did you do? You tried to squelch them. I'm trying to find the exact verse. Pasuk, Parak Beis, Pasuk Yud Beis. Vatashku es Nazirim yain. You force-fed the Nazirim wine instead of acknowledging that they're unique and distinct. You tried to profane them. Val Neviim. And regarding the prophets, Tvisim Lemor, Lo Tinabu. You try to force them not to prophesy. You didn't want to hear the message, right? Squelch the message. So the Haftarah goes on to say the following. When a lion roars, and I apologize, I'm trying to find that. the last verse of the Haftarah. So going back to Perek Gimel Pasuk Vav, Im yetaka shofar be'ir v'am lo yecharadu. When the shofar is blown, the wake-up call, saying that there's what? That there's an issue, there's fear, there's a reason for us to be alarmed. People are not going to be alarmed. They're not going to have fear. They're not going to have dread. Aryeh sha'ag mi lo yira. When the lion roars, will people not fear? Hashem Elokim diber mi lo yinaveh. When God speaks, can the prophet not prophesize? Meaning what? Prophecy is not something that can be squelched. Prophecy is not something that can be held back. There's a need, there's an obligation, there's a need to get it out. And Yirmiyahu says this, others say this, but we're quoting Amos here. What did they do? They tried to squelch the Navi. They tried to prevent the Navi. They were trying to avoid what he was saying. What was it that Yosef was saying? That you're very confident here. You're now back in Israel. We're very wealthy. We're doing very well in an agrarian economy. We're cattle barons. We have thousands of head of sheep and cattle. But Joseph saw winds of change coming. There's going to be a different reality. We're not going to be able just to survive here in our little Israel. We're going to have to go into an area, a world, that's going to be extremely seductive, that's going to be challenging, that's going to challenge our ability to maintain our integrity with its sophistication, in terms of economics, in terms of dress, in terms of art, theater, culture, in terms of development, architecture, its urban climate and environment, which is very different than an agricultural environment. They were going to go to Egypt, and they needed a different approach economically and financially. In a famine, you can't make it as a farmer. In a famine, you can't make it as a herdsman. They were going to need a different approach. That was the first nevuah. And likewise spiritually. What it would take to develop the nation in a cocoon, so to speak, in a well environment where you're not threatened by the Hittites and the Jebusites and the different Canaanite nations, because you can see them for what they are, primitive, and they're not a threat. It's very different when you go to Egypt, which is a seductive, enticing, very exotic world. There you need a different leadership and a different approach to teaching the Masorah, to communicating the Masorah to the next generation that will be fluent and articulate in Egyptian language, Egyptian culture, Egyptian mores. That's what Joseph was saying. Joseph's two nevuot at the beginning, he couldn't control those. He had to communicate that, because that ultimately would be the future. That ultimately would be the way of maintaining the Masorah and keeping the Jewish people and making the Jewish people into the nation they would become, the spiritual entity that it would be, that would ultimately transform humanity. But it's going to have to survive. It's going to have to be able to live in a different kind of humanity and reflect itself and lead humanity in a different context with different challenges. And they try to suppress that. Just like Aryeh Sha'ag mi lo yira, when the lion roars, who will not be scared? Who will not tremble from it? Likewise, Hashem Elokim diber mi lo yinaveh, when God tells the prophet to communicate, to reflect, to teach, to give us guidance, can the prophet suppress that? How can you suppress that prophet? So the very Joseph, the very brother that they had animus towards, the very brother that they were threatened by, that brother was not a threat to them. That brother was giving them an opportunity. He was giving them knowledge, ideas, the opportunity to ultimately fulfill what they were looking to fulfill. That is the development of a nation that through its values and its approach would transform the destiny of humanity. It would be a different path. It would be a different road. It would be a different guise and a different vehicle in Egypt than it was in the pasture lands of Canaan. And that they tried to suppress. And what the Haftarah, what the Navi is saying is that you don't suppress that. Don't be afraid. Don't be threatened by challenges. Because you have the tools, you have the value system, you have the principles that will be able to stand up and ultimately will be able to take those challenges and transform humanity. And that's the challenge we're given today. It's Joseph's challenge, to be able to deal with the winds of change, to be able to deal with a new environment, a new world, not to be threatened, but to stand up to that formidable task and ultimately fulfill our purpose as a nation. Not two strands as they had thought, the Joseph dominant strand and the peasants and serfs, the others, the rest of the Jews. No, one people with our different values, our different approaches, but have the ability to take on new challenges, to take our principles and manifest them in different worlds. Thank you.